News has become a commodity, and it's been sold to us, and it's sold by people who know it needs to make us feel sad and furious and agitated and scared and like we're going to lash out. And I've always wanted, my writing to be about entertainment and connection and empathy. And I've wanted to write things that make people feel a little bit more understood. So yeah, as a writer, my intention has always been the absolute opposite of what the news does.
Hello and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. I'm Anne Morgan, a writer and Royal Literary Fund Fellow, and this podcast is a really fun space where we get to bring special guests into conversation with clips from our archive featuring hundreds of writers talking about the creative life, their process, the highs and lows of putting words on the page. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Daisy Buchanan. Hi Daisy, how are you?
Hello Anne, I'm great. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's my pleasure. And Daisy, for those who don't know, is an award-winning journalist, author and broadcaster. Her novels include Insatiable and Pity Party, and her non-fiction includes How to Be a Grown-Up and The Sisterhood. We're going to be talking particularly today about her two most recent books, Read Yourself Happy and her new novel, All Grown Up, a retelling of Little Women. I'm really excited particularly to have you here today, Daisy, because we both were in the strange position of writing books about reading just before the National Year of Reading was announced. So it's kind of been an odd timing, really, hasn't it? Because it sounds almost as though our books might have come out with that in mind, but neither of us knew that was happening. And in fact, we got in touch because you were working on Read Yourself Happy and you wanted to talk about reading internationally as part of your research for that. What prompted you to write that book? Why did you decide to look into reading, and particularly how reading can make you happier?
My big prompt, I think, was during the pandemic at the start of 2020 and realising that all I wanted to do is be on my phone and kind of consume news, and consume is the word. And it felt like this kind of awful bottomless churn of it. And I really noticed how anxious it made me. And as well as having a lot of anxious thoughts, I felt physically all wrong and very, very dysregulated. And really, as an experiment, I thought I'll pick up a book. And the first book I read was the first one in the Cazalet Chronicles series. It was so exciting to pick up that book and read in the way I read that I was a child and fall face first into this universe and be so excited. And I was quite resistant and reluctant. And I thought, this is going to be a saga. It might be quite dry. It's all going to be quite heavy. I suppose I associated that word saga with Catherine Cookson. And I know lots of people adore Catherine Cookson. She's, brilliant and underrated and does incredible things. But I've always looked at those books that, they're going to be about lots of people being very unhappy. But yeah, what the Cazalet Chronicles are about are like tiny joys and triumphs and pettiness. And they're just so human at a time when I really wanted to be in touch with the human. And I think maybe because I'm a novelist, or maybe more, I think I'm a reader before I'm a writer. All I want is tiny, tiny details about people, the way people live their life, like specifically what they're putting on their toast and that gap between what they say and what they mean and the tiny jealousies that put them off, all of that. And those books are so rich in those. But yeah, I do think that widely there was a moment of us after many, many years of increasing online activity feeling so frazzled and fried, and that, I felt at my wit's end in a very literal sense, I guess. And I discovered that reading was nourishing and restorative, and it felt, soft and soothing. And some books are more soothing than others, but I realised that it was restoring everything that I felt the internet had taken away from me.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I have to confess, I haven't read the Cazalet Chronicles, but you're not the only writer I know who has recently read them, particularly I think during the pandemic. I think a number of us turned to substantial classics during that period, didn't we? And that was one of the choices that seemed to be quite popular. And so I'm feeling I should maybe give them a try.
Well, what was perfect about then, and depressingly, they've only become more prescient and more right for now, that first year, which is about everyone holding their breath and waiting to see whether or not the Second World War is going to be declared. And that felt so apropos for 2020, which was such a strange time where we were all absolutely fixated by the news, but there wasn't so much news. We latched hungrily onto whatever we could find. And I realised quite early on that what I thought was news wasn't. There was a new panicky piece, a new spin, that news had shifted from being something that was on at 9 o'clock at night, or, my dad would come home with the Times, the Telegraph, and the front cover would be something like, a bill has been passed, and there'd be lots of, old white men in the House of Commons looking pleased with themselves. And news has become a commodity, and it's been sold to us, and it's sold by people who know it needs to make us feel sad and furious and agitated and scared and like we're going to lash out. And, and I've been a journalist at the more sort of, lighter lifestyle end of things. And I've always wanted, my writing to be about entertainment and connection and empathy. And I've wanted to write things that make people feel a little bit more understood. So yeah, as a writer, my intention has always been the absolute opposite of what the news does.
Yeah, I think this is a great moment to bring in our first clip from the archive. So we've got poet John Sadiq talking about a poem that has meant a great deal to him in his own reading life.
You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. This short piece is an unashamed bow of gratitude to poetry. I can honestly say that there have been times in my life when poetry was there for me when no one else was. And I'd like to talk about one particular poem by a very particular poet, Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. This poem came to me by very strange circumstances indeed. A number of years ago, I was very poorly with depression. Life had served up what seemed like a wrecking ball of stresses that I didn't have the capacity or knowledge of how to process. And I found myself at a great halt, both in life and artistically. I talked to my doctor and was referred to a therapist who, after a number of weeks of getting to the heart of the matter and finding out what I did for a living, brought me a gift of a photocopy of the poem. I still have it to this day, in the pocket at the back of one of my journals. Mental health difficulties have a hugely isolating effect on the sufferer. This is something we really need to be more open and vulnerable about in our society. Isolation compounds a sense of limitation, as invisible hands squeeze and reduce life to something very small and claustrophobic. For Mary Oliver to have even written the taboo word loneliness into a poem seems to me to be one of the greatest acts of courage I've ever seen from a writer. The fact that she then manages to lift both her and the reader's eyes to watch the wild geese high in the clean blue air as they head home again is simply an artistic and human miracle. I would read the poem each day during this time, and every time I read it, it opened me up to life again. Truly, the writer cannot know if their work will mean something to another person, a reader who is out there, but we must write and read, trusting that literature will do its job and find for itself where it needs to go.
So that was John Sadiq on writers he admires, and in particular Mary Oliver, the poet. I wondered, Daisy, did anything jump out for you from that? Anything resonate with your own journey with reading and how it soothed your own mental struggles during the pandemic and the book that you've written about? Because the subtitle of your book is How to Use Books to Ease Your Anxiety.
I love the way John talked about that poem of finding him when he needed it most. And I think that's so common. And I think those moments when we are really, really struggling, and it's that, to quote another poem, it's the how the light gets in bit, that pinprick, that little, the hand reaching out for your hand. And the way he talked about Mary Oliver's bravery in using that word, loneliness. And
yeah, which I found interesting. He said it's a taboo word. Yeah. Do you agree with that?
That really interests me because I think most of us will feel a version of it. I'm really curious about how we all define it, because for me, loneliness is not being by myself. loneliness is being in a large group of people and feeling completely disconnected and stuck and lost. I remember being a student at university and going out dancing, which is something I normally love to do, but during an episode of very shaky mental health and feeling it was almost like an out-of-body experience. And I've, stopped drinking now. At the end of June 2026, I will have been sober from alcohol for 4 years.
Wow.
Touch wood. Luck on my side and God or whoever willing. But I remember, those moments with alcohol actually reaching for it because I wanted to feel that connection and losing it. I mean, I'm a neurodivergent woman and I meet lots of neurodivergent people, and that sometimes feels, that moment of connection, like the opposite of loneliness. I've just been teaching, I'm meeting another neurodivergent writer, and I think quite quickly we sort of unmasked in front of each other, and I could see this really, really delicious thing in them when they were relaxed. They were like, oh, yeah, I don't need to craft my adult, sophisticated, shell. I can just let go. And that felt like a real privilege to know a person that way. And I think that, and I write in Read Yourself Happy about my journey with alcohol, and that I started reading all these sobriety memoirs because I thought they might prove to myself that I was fine. Like in Elton John's book, he writes about how he got very, very drunk and bought a tram and woke up with no memory of it. And I was like, well, I've not bought any trams, so I'm fine. And what I found was, again, connection. When I'd been feeling lonely, someone, saying, I have felt these big feelings. I've tried to resolve these big feelings by temporarily numbing them. And it made everything worse. And
do you think reading is a substitute for alcohol use, or does it replace some of that in your life?
Oh, in some ways. Well, the first thing is I love nothing more than a book with a great party. I think Rivals is back on TV imminently, if it isn't already. And I'm a Jilly Cooper super fan. As anyone who's met me for about 3 seconds can
I was going to
testify.
mention, actually, I know you are a Jilly Cooper fan. Yeah.
And what's so gorgeous about those Jilly books is there are so many parties, and any book that's about a sort of delightful social setting, it's always a thrill to experience those parties vicariously and throw yourself into them. So I think the obvious part is maybe that. But then there is also a feeling that you don't need to be numb, that the books I love are the ones that see me in all of my shame and joy and pride and vulnerability and, the whole thing. And yet it is that moment of connection that I'm seeking. And now, the more I read, the more widely I want to read, and the more I'm excited to read books about people who are nothing like me and experiences I've never had and will never know. But I think in terms of alcohol substitute books, but books that make me, happy I'm sober and give me the thing I was always seeking through alcohol, it's often those books that make me feel extreme empathy and books that make me feel very seen and understood.
It's interesting listening to you talk. I've been thinking, because obviously we're being told, the National Year of Reading, which we've talked about before, and I've got slightly mixed feelings about it. I think we've both got sort of mixed feelings about some of the messaging perhaps, but we're being told as part of that we're in a reading crisis. And actually loneliness is something that people discuss. I wonder if those two are linked. I wonder if there is actually a sense of community that comes through reading that many people are missing. I mean, you may not agree we're in a reading crisis. I'm not sure I do. And I sometimes worry about that language because I don't know how helpful that is.
I think I agree with you. I believe that the Queen's Reading Room charity down that reading for 5 minutes a day makes us feel more connected and eases that loneliness. We talk about how, it's, it's a huge threat to our health and it causes, all these conditions. And I don't think in all that panic, we don't stop to kind of, interrogate it and wonder about it. And also to say, well, I think it's probably normal to be a little bit lonely. And surely this is a very, very, very lonely time where we can, through our phones, see so many lives we'll never know. And I think I find that a very isolating experience sometimes. But yeah, also, I don't think we are going to get anyone to read by saying, this is a crisis and this is a problem and you must read more. I think reading is a lot like sports at school. Now, I was a big reader at school, but I was very sports shy. I don't think I ever voluntarily or willingly did any exercise until I was about 30 because it was so miserable at school.
You're into running now, aren't you? Yeah.
But it took that long for me to be like, I don't have to be good at this. This is about me feeling good when I do it. That's all it is. And I don't think we talk about that. I don't think we say, look, there is a book out there for you. We focus so much on novels, and I think there are brilliant arguments for reading novels and the way they boost our empathy and boost our imagination. But I think for lots of people, that's probably not the right way in. Like, read about, gardening or cars or cooking, or read about the thing that you're really passionate about and want to know more about. And then that might be enough to make you curious about the other books. But yeah, to say, I think in a way, calling it a crisis might be making it worse. And I'm sure you do as well. I talk to lots of people who say, I feel bad because I don't read. I know I should read. I don't read. It's another one of the 8,000 things I don't do that I beat myself up for not doing. And I want to say, look, we are recording in 2026. It's never been harder. There have never been more things competing for our attention. I mean, it took me a long time to understand because I am in I was going to say love-hate relationship with my phone. It's a hate-hate relationship. And my phone feels like alcohol. And at the end of my drinking, I thought, I'm not enjoying this and I want to stop and I want out, but I don't know how. And my phone feels worse for me and much more damaging and harder to quit than alcohol ever did. But yeah, of course, we're all addicted to something that's been made to be addictive. And I do think reading is for rebels. Whenever we sit down and go away and read, no one can sell us anything. No one can sneak in. No one can make us feel bad about ourselves. No one can interrupt us. It's a way of reclaiming all of the focus that has been stolen from us. The one thing that's been stolen from us is the idea that joy and happiness and contentment can be free or cheap. Like, reading is, relatively speaking, and I know, hardbacks are very expensive and, you can spend a lot of money on books, but it's so accessible. You can go to a library, they can have it. My local supermarket has a big donation stand of books at the end. Makes me sad in a way that I often think they're devalued, but I also think it's really important that books should be available anywhere. And another thing I think about all the time is compare the price of a brand new, shiny, dust-jacketed hardback book with the price of the cheapest, most average bottle of wine in the pub. And what will stay with you for longer and what will make you feel better in the long run. I hope that's not too earnest.
Yeah. No, but also, I mean, there are amazing charities as well as libraries. There are things like the Book Banks initiative now, which is making sure books are freely available for people who wouldn't be able to buy them all, but for whom the weekly budget has to go on other things. Yeah. So it, as you say, it is potentially very cheap to get books, and that's great. I'm with you on the idea of this kind of worthy thing. I think it's kind of counterproductive, and something I often say when people ask me about reading internationally and how to broaden their reading out, I will say, well, much as you just said, use your passions, use your interests. If you like crime fiction, to see what crime fiction's like in China or in South America, or if you like love stories, well, what about a love story set in a polygamous society? How does that work? And I think it's that, using your own inclinations as a guide rope, and it's a journey of enthusiasm and discovery and curiosity rather than something that has to be done and, got to fit it into my life. Yeah, I think that's a really important thing.
And I think just trying to notice how it makes us feel. I really, really feel it physically when I've been on my phone for too long. There's a heaviness and it's in my calves and it's in my shoulders, and there's a kind of a heat that I get on my face, and it's not, just that I'm full of too many anxious thoughts. And then, reading, it's like I don't dive, but when I read descriptions about diving, when you drop into stillness, and I can feel that my breath changes and it gets slower and deeper, and it's meditative. And I'd say I struggle with meditation because you're like, empty your mind. How? I do try, but I think there is something about a book that it gently leads you away from your anxious thoughts, because by giving you something else to consider and focus on, it's not a terrifying emptiness. It's more of a very gentle, slowly, because we crave stimulation and we crave input. And I think what books do is they give us some of that, but perhaps not as much as we used to, when everything beeps and whistles and buzzes and is, shrill and bright.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Now, thinking about your fiction writing as part of that and your new novel, All Grown Up, we have in the RLF archive a whole section of pieces written by writers about the classic book they'd like to rewrite. And I was really struck when I came across this piece by Diane Sheldon talking about the story that she'd like to rewrite. So I thought perhaps we could listen to that together.
The classic book I'd like to rewrite is actually a film, though it did begin life as a short story and eventually became a book. Its provenance may be less than straightforward, but there's no doubt that it is a classic. In fact, it is arguably the second most popular and inspirational Christmas story ever told, the first being the birth of a baby in a manger. The film, of course, is It's a Wonderful Life. It's a Wonderful Life is the antithesis of Dickens' A Christmas Carol. In the latter, Ebenezer Scrooge, a man whose life is judged a success by himself and society, is visited by spirits who show him that, in fact, it is a failure. He has lived without love and has done nothing but increase the misery of the world. In It's a Wonderful Life, George Bailey, a man who once had dreams, but whose life is judged a failure by himself and his society, is saved from suicide by an angel who shows him how valued he is and how much more miserable the world would be if he'd never been born. For much of our history, no matter how small a man's life, a woman's was smaller. Women couldn't even dare to dream. Lucky to be able to leave the house, women weren't the explorers or the adventurers. Women ran homes, not countries, companies, or wars. They weren't the heroes of the stories, whether victorious or tragic. They were the other characters, the wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters. They did the things that women do, in the background, away from praise and recognition. They nursed the hero when he was ill and listened when he told his tales. They cooked his food, warmed his bed, and bore his children. In my rewrite, George would be Georgia. On a cold and snowy Christmas Eve, she sits alone. She was born at a time that allowed her dreams, but not the chance to pursue them. She married and had children. She was the wife who made her husband's life easier, and the mother who made cakes for the bake sale, went over homework, and attended every school event. But now she's by herself, wondering what her life was for. She has won no prizes or accolades, had no celebrity or obvious success. She's always been in the background, one meaningless member of life's perpetual crowd scene. I might never have been born for all my life has meant, she says out loud. You can back that truck up right now, says the young woman suddenly standing beside her. George's angel shows her how much poorer the world would have been without all the acts of kindness and thoughtfulness that she did every day, week, month, and year. All the care she gave to her family and friends. The millions of things that wives and mothers do that go unnoticed by the big wide world, but matter greatly in the little one where most of us live. If the world was made only of adventurers and warriors and empire builders, where would it be, asked the angel. Where indeed?
So that was Diane Sheldon talking about rewriting It's a Wonderful Life. Now, I was really struck there, Daisy, by some parallels with your book, All Grown Up, a retelling of Little Women. I was wondering if anything particular jumped out for you listening to that.
I love the way that Diane there touched on something we had just been talking about detail. And that, is what draws me so and what fascinates me. And I think it's interesting to think about the parallels between, if you think about It's a Wonderful Life as a rewrite or a retelling of A Christmas Carol, that they're sort of opposite stories that kind of end up the same. But, George in It's a Wonderful Life is a good man and beloved by the community. But am I about to destroy a beloved and iconic Christmas classic by saying it's still all about male ego at the end, isn't it? It's about wanting to be the most important person and, about the sort of the despair of thinking that you're beyond help or beyond connection. And that's, I love that film, and it's, it always makes me cry. It's a beautiful thing. But at that time, especially, women didn't have the luxury of despair. They just had to to keep going. And in my retelling, in All Grown Up, Louisa is the mother of 4 girls, and she has lost, she's grieving. Beth has died, and her terrible husband, Will, has bailed. When the girls are small, he's more or less gone, this is really hard. This isn't how I imagined it. I can't do it anymore. I'm off. And then his daughter has died, and he said, this is too hard for me. I'm not going to show up. I'm not going to be in your lives. And he's a very minor part of the book. And I was inspired a little bit by reading about L.M. Alcott's life. And in Little Women, their father, I can't remember if he's a doctor or a chaplain. He's doing something really noble and helpful in the Civil War. But her real dad was incredibly well-intentioned and did wonderful things like setting up an inclusive school, and I think was shunned by the community because I believe he encouraged black students to attend the school at a time when everyone else was very upset about that. And I think that's very noble and very principled, but also he frequently led the family into penury. He made decisions that made everything so much harder for the family that he should have been raising. And that's one of the reasons that L.M. Alcott wrote, like, to make some money, because there was no money. Maybe that's what's interesting about the story I saw, where they've all come out of the shadow of this man, without, their dad, they wouldn't be there, but it's not his story anymore. And it is about carrying on and finding, little pockets of joy, I think, in the detail and in the day. And I think that's all a life can be, really. And again, it's all about seeing who we are in relation to each other. Like, I think it's it's a well-worn trope, but, it is said that if you're feeling really low, if you do a nice thing for another person, that can lift you out of the slough of despond. And because my working title for All Grown Up was, I wanted to call it The Main Characters, because I thought they all think it's about them. They all think they're the main one, and it's really about Louisa, who is at the core
what I was going to say, because
everything.
Much as Diane imagines for her retelling of It's a Wonderful Life, you begin the novel with Louisa alone on Christmas Eve. And actually, there's a brilliant subversion of the opening. The novel begins, Christmas won't be Christmas without any presents. It will be better. And she's looking forward to having Christmas alone, having spent so many years caring for this brood and dealing with all the stress and all the fallout of the tragedies that have hit the family. And yeah, it's really interesting. She very much feels like the main character of, and your sympathies seem to be with her, I would say. I mean, interestingly as well, because you chose to write in the first person, but the first person from the point of view of Louisa and her 3 surviving daughters, whereas The Little Women itself was in third person omniscient narrator, wasn't it? How come you made that switch? What made you decide to go into their heads in that way?
I think I always write in the first person. There's one in my second novel, there are 2 narrators, and one is in the first person, one's in the third person. But when I realised I knew Louisa, I knew her, and it felt so natural to me to borrow that voice. She felt so immediate to me. And I think I always write character first. They always sort of turn up and they know exactly who they are and what they want to say. And I did have a go at writing the others in third person, but I really wanted to make their voices different. And you've got Meg, and Meg is pregnant and retreating from a marriage she's not sure about, and she's a bit bored and a bit uncertain. Jo has been through something quite difficult, and she's coming out the other side of a very painful relationship, and she's finding herself. And then Amy is quite naive, and Amy has these girl boss fantasies of thinking that she's going to save the family and she's going to have a brilliant, brilliant business, and she doesn't know what yet, but when she comes up with an idea, it's going to be great. And I thought there was so much humour in all of the girls, in what they believed about themselves and that not being true. And as a reader, those are the books I love. I'm thinking about Diary of a Nobody, and you're hearing, I think, from Peter in the first person, but you know him better than he does. Good Behaviour by Molly Keane, which is one of my favourite black comedies, with a heroine who is really, really delusional about who she is and how her life works and what can happen. And you do have that moment, I think, of feeling in on it. It's quite a sort of delicious conspiratorial feeling. I guess as well because I wanted that sense that the girls, the Marches, were all, legally, officially adults. But as soon as they came back to the family home, they'd like revert into teenagers. And I thought the first person voice to get all those like, Mum, sort of, it's not fair. And why is the internet broken moments? I thought that was the most fun way to do that.
Yeah, and it comes across brilliantly. I mean, it's such an enjoyable read.
Thank you.
I wondered, because obviously you're talking about it as a retelling, there are elements of mischief and subversion in the book. I mean, I'm thinking in particular of a minor character who appears to view the house at one point. He's actually a very timid dominatrix and a very caring one, actually, as it turns out. But she sort of subverts the idea of what how you might imagine a dominatrix to be, just in a very short scene. And I wondered whether there were any things about the original that you were consciously subverting when you were working on this book.
I think there are a couple of things that everyone knows about Little Women that I wanted to have in the manuscript. The hair selling and the book burning, they are there in different ways. The scene that haunted me that I could never quite get right is in the original. Meg goes to a ball and she gets a bit dressed up and she stays with some posh friends. And I was like, oh, who is that enchanting girl? And she comes back and she gets even more dressed up. And everyone's horrified and she's kind of slut-shamed. And it was, oh, that's too much. You're too exposed. You're wearing too much makeup on. And I was trying to figure that out. And what I've ended up doing is writing about Meg and her NCT friends and these sort of different, women. And that ended up becoming a new story, I suppose, is, wanting to write about, what's funny in that world and kind of the culture of that world and, who you'd sort of meet in that group. And I suppose perhaps it's tricky to do a version of that fits in the 21st century. I could have maybe gone down the tradwife route, but that's another book for another time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe, but that was a hard thing to bring in. And to be honest as well, initially I wasn't sure what to do about Beth, if she was still with us, if she was going to die kind of in present times. And I couldn't quite make her work on the page. As soon as she was dead, she got very chatty. Because she is in the flashbacks, like you do see her and you do meet her. And there's one scene I wrote, which I really like, where Beth has been very ill and she has borne it with great grace and fortitude. And it's often remarked upon like how good and noble and patient she is and how hard she's trying. And she says to Louisa, you know what, I don't feel like being good anymore. I feel really, really, really fed up. And Louisa, in a moment of genius that I credit to Louisa and not me, comes up with an activity for her to help her kind of release some of her rage and her distress. And those moments, and I know it sounds a bit woo and a bit annoying when writers say this, but the family had taken over. I was just the secretary of the book.
Now, something else we have in common besides writing novels and writing books about reading is we both live on the Kent coast. You live in Margate, and I wanted to spend a bit of time thinking about how that place plays into your work or whether it does. And so to get us thinking about seaside life, we have a clip from Anna Reynolds talking about her relationship with Weston-super-Mare.
The sea washes in twice a day here, and when it leaves everything behind it on the beach for everyone to see. I wrote this as the first line of a play many years ago. The place that inspired and still inspires me to write is a miserable, windswept, depressed, mud-haunted, ugly, beautiful, grey and white and just sometimes turquoise seaside town. In Weston-super-Mare, on the Somerset coast near Bristol, the tide goes out completely twice every 24 hours and leaves behind a vast expanse of grey, stinking mud. When it comes in, the sea is always an uneasy brown, regardless of the colour of the sky. I've never really known what makes Weston super, but I've always loved the place since I was a small child. Every August between 1970 and 1980, my mother, father and I would get in the family car and begin the 110-mile drive from Coventry to the seaside at Weston. Despite my desire to get there now, my father, who was born in 1911 and served in World War II, would drive at 20 miles an hour all the way. Anyone who passed him was an idiot and speed was the devil. There was no need to rush, was there? Yes, I would think, yes, there is a reason. But secretly, I think I loved how long it took. Every year my father would say, as we sat holding up the traffic, "It'll be worth the wait." And it was. From September, I would start my obsessive holiday countdown to the following August. Miserable in my West Midlands life, I would lie in my bed, seeing not my house overlooking the cemetery, but the flat vista of mud, the shivering sands, the slowly creeping tide, the donkeys on the beach, the sea, always the sea. I counted the days. They took forever. In between being bullied and hating the rest of my teenage life, I drew pictures in my mind. My life wasn't so bad if I could have these 2 weeks a year there, was it? We always stayed in the same flat in the same road, with a view of the sea if you stood on a stool and craned your neck around the window, bent double and peered through a bathroom bolt hole. And the sun always shone, but that almost certainly is a false memory, according to the photographs that show us all sat in deck chairs, wrapped in clothing suitable for an Arctic winter, unsmiling. So what? I didn't care. I didn't know about the Mediterranean and heat back then. I didn't care about anything but the sea and the donkeys. There definitely were donkeys. That wasn't my imagination. There are photographs of them too. They all had names written in bright, faded colours on their nosebands. Joey, Ariel, Robbie, Daisy, Lulu. I rode up and down and up, on the donkeys until one magical moment when I was put on a pony instead, and I spent my summers obsessing over Pinto, a small brown and blonde pony who I fell instantly in love with, and as a lonely, confused 10-year-old, thought that he loved me back. I thought about him all the months in between holidays, and as soon as I got there, I ran to the beach and looked for him, and he was there. Every year he was there, my boy, my pony, my Pinto. I told him my troubles and he murmured back. I wrapped my legs around him because, frankly, I was too big for him, and he took me to the sea slowly and reluctantly, and then cantered back and gave me my lifelong love of riding. Until the day came when ponies were banned from the beach, and Pinto was not there when I got off the train and ran all the way to the beach to see him. That was 40 years ago, but you can tell I've got over it completely.
That was Anna Reynolds. And she goes on, it's part of a longer piece, she goes on to say that in her adult life, she found her writing was flat and lifeless until she took the decision to move back to Weston-super-Mare, where she now lives. And that place is really the bedrock of her work. Have you always lived in Margate, Daisy? Or if not, what drew you there?
No, I moved from London about 9 years ago, and I grew up in Dorset, not nearly as near the sea as I am now, but, you know, the sea was a drive away, but it was there, it was present. There is something, isn't there, about the edge of the world feeling, I think. I've always liked that people go to the seaside to behave badly. It's that holiday from real life feeling. And Margate I adore because there are so many contradictions there, and it can be so peaceful. If on a wintry day you're watching the sea like smashing against the wall and the drama of the spume, and sometimes you see seals, and sometimes these waves are really, really lifting up and very waving to indicate how high. On Christmas Eve, me and my friend Rebecca were talking about going for a dip, as in we were going to stand in the sea and get straight out again. And it was a bit brisk out there. And my husband said before we left, don't go if it looks like you might end up on the news. And we laughed and went, oh no, of course not, thinking, it'll be fine. It wasn't fine. The waves were like latte foam on the shoreline. They had been whipped up into such a froth, and it was just full of people in anoraks. I think there's some hopefuls in dry robes who'd taken a look and gone, oh no, that's a little bit much. But then on a summer's day, it's completely different. I love that the fact that it's a place where people still go and wear very bright clothes in a very grey and beige era. It's full of people, you know, with different agendas. And Margate as well, you've got that clash of people who just want to come and, you know, have a lovely time in the sunshine and get drunk, and kids who want to play in the arcade. And then Margate has that kind of bougie creep, and people want to go to the galleries, which are brilliant. The one I love, North Down Road, which is a bit of a you've got to kind of know where you're going. It's called Quench, and they've always got stuff that's really original, and it's just art that makes you smile without really knowing why. And there's a really fun thing in Margate that happens around January called Off Season, where everything becomes a gallery. Every cafe, every pub, people, open up their houses. So I think it's quite playful and quite anarchic, and I think we're all stowaways, and there is a mix of people who really I need to comfortably and live an entirely new life, and then people who maybe are running away in a gentler, more sedate way. But
you started writing books after you moved to the seaside then, didn't you? Is that right?
I did. My first book, How to Be a Grown-Up, came out right when we moved, just before. And I don't know, certainly with fiction and novels, my first novel, Insatiable, and I started writing that right around that time. And I wrote 50,000 words and got completely stuck. And I had made the fatal error of getting my characters to all sit down around a dinner table, and they're having a big passive-aggressive fight and not talking to each other. And now, I'm just currently, hopefully, about to finish my 6th novel. And now I figured out, keep them moving, keep them talking. Otherwise, all is lost. It's very hard to make them get up from that table again. And I was thinking, I don't know what to do. And there was this one character who didn't really fit with the rest. And she was quite sneery and she was a bit older. And I thought, I've given her the wrong name and she's not really doing very much. And should I just get rid of her? What purpose is she serving in this book? And then I went, no. She's got the right name and she is a bit snarky and a bit mean, but I've been writing her wrong, and she holds the key to the whole book. This is the story. And I remember that because it was really, really rainy, and I'd come back from the gym and I was very sweaty and I couldn't tell where the sweat stopped and the rain began. And I was coming from the supermarket and I had 2 quite heavy bags and they were really digging into my palms. And it was a very visceral memory of having that sudden, not really thinking about anything in particular and panicking a bit and thinking about the book and thinking, oh no, I don't know what to do. And just that moment of everything clicking into place when I was in motion.
So something about walking. People often say this, actually, writers often say being outside walking. And I think particularly by the sea, there's something very, refreshing about that landscape and about that contrast, isn't there, between land and water. And
I wonder if it's that whoosh, the noise, the white noise of the sea kind of cleans you out a bit. Your thoughts maybe seem a bit less stark and startling. It's kind of a safe way of trying things out in your head.
One of my visits to Margate was to the Margate Book Festival, the Bookie as it's known, and that was in the Turner Contemporary, which is an amazing setting. And in fact, it was Dale, your husband, who interviewed me, which is wonderful. But festivals are part of the writing experience. And I have to say, you're a writer that I always admire for how you manage your public profile and deal with that side of things. I mean, you've got a Substack, you're very good on Instagram, you have done the Your Booked podcast with great success. So I wanted to ask you about that side of things. And to get us thinking about that, we've got poet Jonathan Edwards talking about his experience at festivals.
Once at a festival somewhere in Europe during a spring holiday, I stepped from a reading onto a cobbled street where a carnival was taking place. Fancy-dressed folk stilt walking the avenue, inhabitants leaning through first-floor windows to scope out the floats, blow kisses at neighbours. Once in northern Italy, I found myself trying to get into a prison past a guard who looked me up on Wikipedia on his phone to check that I was really a poet. And once I was inside, I read poems about growing up in the Welsh valleys, and they were translated into Italian for an audience of grinning prisoners. Once, at a sheep festival in mid-Wales, I was halfway through a poem about a hippo when a guy in a tweed cap grabbed the mic and said, "Sorry, but we got to get on with the judging," and 20 sheep strolled into the marquee and took up residence. Once, at another farming festival, I wrote poems to order based on the life of farmers, and all the first day couldn't get a single customer, except for one man who cried when I read him his poem, and on the second morning my queue snaked down past a burger van and onto the show field. Once, at a reading in a Valleys cafe as part of an arts festival, I was halfway through a poem about my mother when the owner shouted, "That's lovely, that is, but I gotta make a cappuccino," and turned on the milk steamer, and it was like a train whistling in a tunnel. Once at a festival in India, I banged and banged on the early morning door of a famous Welsh poet so we could head to the airport and make the flight home, and found him walking towards me down the corridor, just coming back from the night before. Once at a summer music festival, I was sandwiched between two world-famous poets in the programme. And as world-famous poet 1 switched to me, and as I switched to world-famous poet 2, the population movement out and into that tent was so huge that it could be picked up by satellites orbiting the Earth. Once, in a field somewhere in Somerset, I was walking from the complimentary burger tent to my reading when I passed my best friend, standing there in budgie smugglers, staring up at the sky, looking for all the world like someone washed up on the shore of a desert island, and I said, "Hello, hello," and he didn't have a blind clue who I was. Once, I drove 300 miles to a festival, and when I got there, my reading was in a garden shed which was leaning slightly, and someone stood at the door to take tickets, and I asked about an audience, and he said, "Yes, I am one." Once, I slept in the top bunk at a youth hostel, and the snores from a Scottish novelist on the bunk beneath me were like the wind holding up my parachute and standing between me and 8 hours of freefall. Once, I woke early after a god-awful reading and got in my car and drove home, throwing cassettes of the collected Dylan Thomas out through the window and saying, "I'm damned if I'll do this anymore." Once, after 10 years of reading in the back rooms of pubs to one dog and its owner, I found myself at my first festival in front of 500, introduced by a poet who I'd grown up loving, and I walked to the podium and I opened my mouth.
So that was Jonathan Edwards there. Have you ever seen a friend in budgie smugglers at a festival, Daisy?
I wish I had. The closest I can think of is, I think, one year at Port Eliot a while ago. And I was hungover and I was wearing a gold jumpsuit and eating an enormous bacon and egg sandwich. And my friend, the writer and podcaster Andy Miller, nudged me and said, "Watch out, Martin Parr is over there and he's eyeing you with interest." So
Oh, wow.
somewhere there might be a photo of a hungover woman in gold eating a big sandwich.
Oh, I think there are far worse photos that could be taken. Certainly of me, there are. One of the things that I loved about that is it really shows the contrast, I think, between the writing life that is very solitary and the output is quite controlled and managed, carefully edited, work that you spend hours on, days on, weeks on, years on putting together. And then festivals are so much the opposite of that. They're so exposed, aren't they? They're so... It's you never know what's going to happen, and it's not edited at all. It's just what comes at the moment. How do you manage that? Some people really enjoy that experience. Others find it quite difficult. How do you experience it?
It depends very much on the festival. And I think I always go because I'm seeking connection, and I'm always going to say yes to an invitation if the writing's a bit hard and I feel like it's a bit lonely and I'd love a chat and I've not spoken to anyone for days. And someone says, "Do you want to go to the other side of the country in a 14-hour round trip for no money or nearly no money?" Yes, I'll go anywhere. I'll talk to anyone. Please take me with you. Quite recently, I was at a new literary festival where there was, I guess, a great camaraderie between me and the other writers, because there were some things about the way it was organised where I think we felt a bit sort of, left to ourselves. I mean, there's like such a range. I mean, they're bizarrely posh. I might get into trouble for saying this, but never mind. There was one where I was sort of happening in like Grand Castle and its grounds, and I was put up in a very, very, very beautiful house with some exciting luminaries, including the film director, Mike Figgis, who kindly in the morning explained to me how to use the toaster. I think I must have looked a bit slow and a bit sleepy, but it was, that was generous of him, I thought. But I think it's a bit like a wedding where the joy of it for me is meeting people that you'd probably never meet under any other circumstances. And I think, like perhaps in some ways, like with us and our friendship, and I know in our writing we've covered very similar themes, but also, some quite different ones. And what I love is that a festival will throw writers like us together. Or recently I met a writer I didn't know, and I had a really great time getting to know him. But I was really surprised when we were talking about this, how each of us know a lot of writers, but there weren't as many overlaps as you'd expect. And we were saying, "Oh no, but you must meet this person because you'd really get on." And I think that's it, isn't it? I don't know how you feel about this. And you talked about, you're very, very kind about, Instagram and the old social media. And where I struggle is that I hate that feeling like a transaction. I hate that now it feels like there's an enormous amount of pressure on us all to market ourselves and to come up with something quite, that can be measured. And it's like, well, you must use this and sell this many books and do all this stuff. And that really frightens me, and it makes me feel really insecure, and I feel really scared that I'm doing it wrong. And all I want is to hang out with mates and meet like-minded people, and not to at festivals and things, that fear that occasionally you'll see the whites of someone's eyes, or they'll see the whites in your eyes, and you'll think, oh, you're doing that maths of like, is this someone who can help my career? And if so, how? And that's going to affect how nice I am to them. And I just want a good hang. I'm just always, looking for people who might make me laugh. Often I think the further the festival, or the less well organised the festival, the better my chances are of finding those like-minded people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've got very fond memories of, I don't know if you've ever been to the Buchanan Book Festival. If you ever get an invitation there, you should go. It's Scotland's book town, and its nearest train station is an hour away. And so during the book festival, all the townspeople join in and volunteer and drive writers to and from the station. So you can be riding in a car with 3 other writers for an hour, and people put you up. And there are sort of 20 book-related businesses in the town, and one of the bookshops has the green room above it, which is someone's living room. And it's just there's a ceilidh on Saturday night, and it's a real local effort. And you can't help but be embraced by the place and the people and the other writers you're there with, because it's so remote. And it's a really joyful, as you say, it's about that whole experience, which is so much more than just the conversations on stage, or even just the conversations off stage, but it's the whole experience of being in this place that not all these people are ever going to gather in that way again. Is quite an extraordinary
Well, that
thing,
sounds absolutely magical. If you're listening, I am very keen. I imagine
Well,
lots of people are very keen.
We fixed the programme for the
come
next
in,
festival.
I'll make tea. What else is useful? I'll do the post-its and the signing queue. Whatever you need.
Excellent. Fantastic. Well, Daisy, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on Collected. You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you have any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFCollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by Noise and Order. Our producer was Anne Morgan.